Vertigo, movie review. So Vertigo is an old classic film. It's a 1958 Alfred Hitchcock movie. In 2012, it was in the news, and I don't know how many people remember this. Probably some of you remember this. It was in the news because a British magazine called, I believe, the Sight and Sound magazine had ranked it as the #1 movie of all time instead of Citizen Kane. Every other publication had always ranked Citizen Kane as the best movie of all time, and I guess this magazine had as well up until 2012, when their panel of critics changed their mind and decided that actually Vertigo was the best movie of all time. Now, I think actually in retrospect this was probably something that the media overblew a little bit just for, publicity or clickbait or, just something to talk about. Because I think it was actually just one magazine. It wasn't like the critical consensus everywhere had changed. But it was reported at the time in 2012 like the critical consensus everywhere had changed. Citizen Kane is now officially out. Vertigo is now in. It's now completely official. Vertigo is the best movie of all time. Now, like a lot of people, I had seen Citizen Kane when I was younger, way back when I was in middle school, because it was reported as the best movie of all time, and it was something you felt like you had to see. I'll talk about Citizen Kane maybe in a separate video someday. I didn't actually like Citizen Kane the first time I saw it. Partly because, well, probably mostly because I was expecting it to absolutely blow me away and be like the best movie I'd ever seen. And the expectations versus the slow pace of the movie, and especially I was at a young age when I first saw it. I was, 13 or something like that. I have come to appreciate Citizen Kane, however, in reviewing it. It's one of those movies that if you go in with adjusted expectations can actually be a lot of fun. But enough about Citizen Kane. I'm talking today about Vertigo. Vertigo, in 2012, when it was getting all this press, I had not actually seen it. And I thought this was kind of funny because I actually considered myself a bit of an Alfred Hitchcock fan. Actually, I hesitate to say I'm a little bit afraid of saying I was a bit of an Alfred Hitchcock fan on the internet. Because there's somebody out there who's seen everything that Alfred Hitchcock has ever made 3 different times, and they're going to consider my paltry efforts to watch Alfred Hitchcock's body of works very pathetic by comparison, and I guess maybe it is. But when I was in middle school in the 1990s, I was interested in Alfred Hitchcock's movies. I was the only one I knew at my middle school who even had a vague interest in Alfred Hitchcock, so it seemed like this was some sort of personal interest to me, something that I owned and other people were not interested in. Now back then, of course, it was harder to track down movies than it was now. You just had to wait around to see if it was on cable one night. But a few of them were on cable. Back in my youth, I saw Rear Window was the first Alfred Hitchcock movie I ever saw and really enjoyed it. Psycho really shocked me. I think I was just kind of innocent enough where that shocking scene could still get to me. The Birds, Topaz, Dial M for Murder, Shadow of a Doubt, Suspicion. I saw most of Lifeboat. I actually tuned into it when it was kind of halfway over. And then the Alfred Hitchcock Presents TV show, which was rerun on Nickelodeon in the 1990s. So between all of that, I felt like I had some exposure to Alfred Hitchcock in my youth. Oh, and then I also saw North by Northwest when I was in college. But I never saw Vertigo, and I don't really remember people talking about it when I was younger. I mean, I recognized the name, but I don't remember anywhere in the 1990s anyone saying this is Alfred Hitchcock's best film. Rear Window, North by Northwest, and Psycho were the films I remember people talking about. So when all of a sudden this film was suddenly the biggest movie of all time, I took me a bit off guard. I was at the time, back in 2012, working with a guy who I've nicknamed the Cinephile. He was a film buff, somebody who had studied film in college, and then ended up as an English teacher in Cambodia, because what else are you going to do with a film degree these days? I was working with him in Cambodia, and we would occasionally talk about different films. And when he found out that I had never seen Vertigo, he insisted I come over to his place to watch it. And so I did. He downloaded it from the internet, and we watched it together. And here I am with my review. Now, I want to give a spoiler warning before I get into this review. Which is to say, there are a few twists and turns along the way in this movie. And this movie is best watched knowing nothing about it, if that is at all possible. So if you haven't seen the movie yet, don't watch the rest of my review. Go find a copy somewhere and try not to read anything. Don't go to Wikipedia, don't read the plot summary, don't read the blurb. Just try and go into it as blind as you can. There are a few twists and turns that I think will pay off well if you try and go into this movie blind. The only thing I'll say ahead of time is that this movie has a bit of a slow pace. So just go in with the expectation that it's going to be a slow burn, and that it's going to require some patience. And that's all I'll say. And if you go in with that expectation, and you go in not having read anything about the movie, I think you'll have a few pleasant surprises waiting for you. Okay, that being out of the way, everything from here on out is going to be complete spoilers. I'm just going to spoil everything, and for the rest of this review, I'm going to talk as if the audience for this video is familiar with the movie and knows what I'm talking about when I reference different plot points. Okay, here we go. So there are 3 big twists in this movie, and they all 3 of them caught me absolutely off guard. I did not see any of them coming at all. The first big twist, I did not expect Madeline to actually go through with killing herself halfway through the movie. Even when she was running up the tower, I just assumed Jimmy Stewart was going to get to her because, you know, he was the hero. It was that kind of movie. And then all of a sudden when you saw her body falling off the tower, that shocked me. I was like, whoa, I did not expect the movie to go there. That one really got me good. And then 2, later in the movie, when we find out that her death had been completely faked, again, I was not expecting that. I completely bought it when I saw her body fall off the tower. Completely caught me unaware once again. And then 3, that final scene where Jimmy Stewart is dragging Madeline up onto the tower really had me in goosebumps. I mean, this was just classic Hitchcock. I wasn't sure whose side I was supposed to be on for this thing. I mean, Jimmy Stewart was the hero of the movie, but it was clear that at this point he completely lost his mind, and he might do something crazy. And even though Madeline had done a bad thing, you can't help but feel some sympathy for her as she's being dragged, pleading up the tower. So he's dragging her up the tower, she's pleading for her life, and because it's a Hitchcock movie, you know there's no guarantee of a happy ending, and anything could happen up there. I was really on pins and needles the whole time watching that scene. Also, when I'm talking about scenes that really grabbed me, I thought the opening scene was really good. It has kind of, I mean, I guess if you watch it now, you'd describe it as kind of like a retro vibe and retro special effects. No, retro is the wrong word, isn't it? Because retro is a modern movie trying to imitate an old aesthetic. This is an old movie, but I don't know, something about it just really felt modern. And maybe it felt modern in kind of a retro way, if that makes sense. Like the way new movies will try and imitate older movies. Sorry, I'm not making any sense. I really like the opening scene, and I thought it had kind of a modern vibe to it, even though the effects were obviously dated. I think that's what I want to say. Anyways, those big scenes aside, the opening scene and those 3 shocking plot twists along the way, those 3 the 3 or 4 scenes aside, the rest of the movie I found hard to sit through. I thought it dragged on. I got bored. I was shifting in my seat as I watched it. I kept checking my watch to see how much longer the movie had to go. Now, obviously older movies run at a slower pace, and you have to accept that when you watch an old movie. And especially Hitchcock movies, because Hitchcock likes to slowly add layer upon layer of suspense. So with a Hitchcock movie, you really have to be in a mindset for a slower pace. And usually I am. I mentioned beforehand that Rear Window had been one of my favorite Hitchcock movies when I was younger. And actually, I had rewatched Rear Window shortly before watching Vertigo. Me and my friend the cinephile had watched it together. And Rear Window is another movie where the pace of it moves really slow. But Rear Window, I didn't get bored in. I found the whole movie completely absorbing as you get into it. But Rear Window was a straightforward murder mystery. By contrast, Vertigo had this weird spirit possession storyline that I really had trouble getting into. I mean, for one, I'm not really interested in spirit possession storylines to begin with. I find it a little bit strange. But even if I was, Vertigo drags it out for far too long. Long after the audience, the viewer of the movie already realizes that she's possessed. The movie just keeps dragging it on and giving you more and more hints about the possession. And there's about 30 or 40 minutes in the middle of the movie where the plot just doesn't go anywhere. And I was like, okay, I get it. I get it, movie. She's possessed. Let's just move on now with the story. Now, I was talking with my friend, the cinephile, after we saw the movie, and I was voicing this exact same complaint. And my friend said, but you see, that's the whole beauty of the movie. Once you finish the movie, you realize that actually she wasn't possessed. That whole possession thing was just an elaborate ruse. The cinephile told me that one of his film professors back in college had once said that this movie is the most elaborate murder plan in cinema history. And I agreed. I said, yes, now that the movie is over, I can appreciate that now. But when it was going on, it just seemed like it was a very weird and strange plot. I mean, after it's finished and you realize it was all elaborate fiction the whole time, then that puts it in some perspective. But that doesn't change the fact that it got a little bit boring when you were watching it. And I don't know, you know, I mentioned Citizen Kane at the top of this review as something that I didn't like the first time I saw it and then came to appreciate it in subsequent viewings with adjusted expectations. Maybe the same thing is true of Vertigo. Maybe that when you see it again and you know that she's not really possessed by the spirit and you know that she's faking the whole time, then maybe that would make those scenes more interesting in retrospect. I don't know. I'd be interested in other people's viewing experience of this movie. But the film's history, or at least the critical reception of this film, would maybe seem to support that interpretation. Audiences really didn't appreciate it when it first came out, according to Wikipedia. And it's only in retrospect that critics have really latched onto this film as the greatest film of all time. So Maybe it does just take a while to sink into. I'm going to talk about the ending of this film now. Now, as I said before, I really did find the ending of this film very gripping. By which I mean the ending scene in general. But the actual ending, like the last 10 seconds where you finally get the resolution, that I found to be really disappointed. I wanted to see what would happen between Jimmy Stewart and the Madeline Judy character. I mean, had he gone crazy enough to throw her off the tower? Or did he appreciate that, despite all her faults, this was still the girl he had fallen in love with? I could really see it going either way at that point, and I wanted to see what would happen. I was disappointed, therefore, by the entrance of the nun. I mean, first of all, who was this nun and where did she come from? The whole thing was very what they would call deus ex machina. But secondly, bringing in an outside element really spoiled the tension between the two main characters. I wanted to see how things would have resolved themselves with just the two of them. And thirdly, I didn't find it believable. I didn't think that Madeline would run off the bell tower just because she got startled. In short, I found those last 10 seconds very unsatisfying. But it could have been that this was the only ending that Hitchcock had opened to him. The only ending that Hitchcock had opened to him. Because during the movie code of that period, one of the stipulations of the movie code is nobody was allowed to get away with a crime by the end of the movie. So if Jimmy Stewart had forgiven Madeline, then the movie wouldn't have been up to code because then Madeline would have gotten away with that crime. Conversely, if Jimmy Stewart had thrown her off the bell tower, then the movie wouldn't have been up to code because then Jimmy Stewart would have committed a crime and you couldn't end the movie with Jimmy Stewart having gotten away with that crime. So it could be, it would have been interesting to see, as a hypothetical, what movie Hitchcock would have made had that code not existed. I suspect that code was confining what he could do and that he would have done something else if he had had more options open to him. I guess we'll never know. Okay, a couple other notes here. As we watched the film, my friend, the cinephile, was just pointing all kinds of stuff out to me. Stuff that he had picked up in film school or that you would appreciate if you're a film buff. Most of the stuff I would never have realized on my own. He pointed out a lot of the artistry behind some of the shots, the framing or the angles. He pointed out the long sequences that would just go on without any dialogue at all. This apparently was one of Hitchcock's favorite things to do. Hitchcock believed that film, if done right, could tell its stories with just visuals alone, and that's why there were long sequences without any dialogue. My friend also pointed out to me the various color schemes and motifs that were throughout this movie, pointed out some of the symbolism to me, and pointed out the various homages to Frankenstein. Apparently this film has got a Frankenstein motif going through it, where a lot of different shots or sequences are referencing Frankenstein, which, again, I never would have caught on my own. I mean, I have seen the classic Boris Karloff Frankenstein movie back in the day, but never would have caught all those homages. So, if you're into that kind of stuff, there's a lot to dig into in this film, or so my friend, the cinephile, definitely seemed to think. I'm not really one of those people, though. I'm a simple man. I focus on the story when I watch a movie. I don't really focus on the artistry of the shots or anything like that. But if you're the kind of person who does focus in on that, there's obviously lots to enjoy in Vertigo. Okay, last thing I'm going to talk about is just some information I got off Wikipedia after I saw the film. One of the things I found was interesting that Wikipedia said was reviews of this film were very mixed when it came out. Variety said that the film showed Hitchcock's mastery, but was too long and slow for what is basically just a psychological murder mystery. The Los Angeles Times said that they admired the scenery, but they found the plot was too long and felt it bogs down in a maze of detail. And according to Wikipedia, this is the tone that most of the popular critics took with the film when it first came out in 1958. Now, I thought that was interesting because so often when you watch an old movie from the 1950s, you have to adjust yourself to a different attention span. You have to say, okay, modern attention spans are different than they were in the 1950s. So obviously this film is going to move at a slower pace than modern audiences are used to. Right? That's what you usually say. But I found it interesting that if you go back to the original reviews that came out in 1958, this film was slow-paced, too slow-paced even by the standards of 1958. So, you know, it's no wonder I found that it was hard to sit through. Even back in the 1950s, even with that different attention span people had back then, they were still finding it hard to sit through it. The other little tidbit I want to mention, according to Wikipedia, Hitchcock went back and forth on whether to include the letter writing scene, but he finally decided that he wanted to take it out. The studio, however, overruled him, and they made him keep the letter writing scene in. But that means that if Hitchcock had gotten his way, if the movie had been released the way he wanted it to, then the audience wouldn't have realized that Madeline and Judy were the same person until the very end of the movie. And I think it's almost a pity that Hitchcock didn't get his way, because I think that would have made the last third of the film a lot more interesting. If I had been confused about who Judy really was, just like Jimmy Stewart's character was confused about it, I think that would have made it a lot more interesting for that last third of the film. On the other hand, though, it would have made Judy's motivation really murky. So I can see why there was some sort of need to clear up what Judy's motivation was. And that's obviously why Hitchcock had filmed that scene in the first place. I mean, he filmed it first, then he went back and forth on whether he wanted to cut it out. Then he decided to cut it out, and then the studio overruled him. But he did film it first, and obviously the reason he felt it needed to be filmed in the first place was without that scene, then you have no insight into what Judy's motivation is. So it does kind of work, it does kind of serve a function, and at the same time, though, I think that the end of the movie, or the whole third act of the movie, final act of the movie, would have been much more interesting if the audience didn't know that Judy and Madeline were the same person. And we had to kind of figure it out along with Jimmy Stewart's character. Okay, that's all I have to say about this movie.